It starts like any other day until it doesn't. A black woman walks into a courthouse calm, composed, and completely unaware that she's about to be assaulted by those sworn to uphold the law. They think she's nobody. They humiliate her, violate her, and laugh while doing it. But what they don't know is they just laid hands on the wrong person because she's not just another citizen. She's the one person who has the power to destroy them legally. What follows is a storm of justice exposure and a courtroom twist that flips everything on its head. Stick around, you're not ready for what's coming. And hey, tell us where you're watching from and what time. Drop it in the comments below. It was just after 8 a.m. when Tara Mitchell stepped out of her silver Buick and walked up the stone steps of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. The sun was rising slowly behind the old Spanish moss trees, casting long shadows on the steps. She adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer, squared her shoulders, and clutched a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels clicked softly against the concrete. Each step a quiet declaration. She didn't wear her judicial robe outside the courtroom. She never did. She preferred to enter buildings like a citizen, quiet, composed, observant. But that day she wasn't greeted as a judge. She wasn't even seen as someone with authority. She was just another black woman walking into a place where power had never come easy. At the main security checkpoint. The energy shifted the moment she approached Deputy Hank Riker. A court bailiff known for his rigid attitude and old-school demeanor, narrowed his eyes as she neared the metal detectors. He didn't recognize her, and more importantly, he didn't care to. He stepped forward, thick forearms crossed, and held up a gloved hand. "Ma'am," he said, voice gruff, "I'm going to need you to step out of line." Celeste paused for only a moment. "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker didn't answer right away. His eyes swept over her from her silver locks twisted neatly along her scalp to her pressed slacks to the calm but confident look in her eye. Something about her bothered him. She looked like she belonged there, and in his world, people like her needed to be reminded who was really in charge. No ID displayed. "You can't just waltz into a federal building looking like that," he muttered. Celeste calmly reached into her blazer and produced her federal credentials. The badge gleamed under the light, but Riker didn't even look at it. He took it from her hand, gave it a cursory glance, then slipped it into his pocket. She raised an eyebrow. "I'd like that," returned. He stepped in closer. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word hit like a slap. A second guard, a younger woman, shifted nervously by the X-ray scanner. She clearly recognized the tension but said nothing, just watched. "I need to get to a courtroom," Celeste said firmly. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Riker snapped, "and that includes random checks." "Let's go." He didn't give her time to respond. With one heavy hand on her upper arm, he steered her toward a side hallway away from the foot traffic into a windowless screening room just beyond the security zone. The air inside was cool and still. There was a steel chair in the center of the room, a rolling cart of scanning equipment, and a pair of clippers sitting idle on the edge. Celeste's heart thudded once in her chest. "I don't consent to this," she said clearly. "You have no legal cause to detain me." "You're acting suspicious." "That's cause enough, he replied, motioning to the chair. "Sit down." She didn't move. He leaned in close. "You think that badge you flashed means something not here?" "Not to me." In an instant, two other officers entered the room. One of them, a man in his 30s with a shaved head and nervous eyes, grabbed her left wrist. Another held the other side of the chair. Celeste's voice rose. "This is a violation. I want your names," but no one answered. Instead, Riker grabbed the clippers. "What are you doing?" she demanded, standard protocol. "You could be hiding something in that mop," he said, gesturing to her locks. Celeste tried to rise, but a sharp grip pushed her back down. The clippers buzzed to life. The sound filled the room like a swarm of bees. Before she could react, she felt the cold vibration touch her scalp. A thick coil of silver hair fell to the floor. Then another and another. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She sat there as her dignity was stripped from her strand by strand, watched it collect in piles on the tiled floor like pieces of her past being torn away. Laughter echoed from one of the guards. "She looks better already," he muttered. "Should have come in here with some respect," Riker said, wiping loose hairs from his sleeve. "Now you look more presentable." Celeste's fists clenched in her lap, the skin over her knuckles pale, but her voice when it returned was steady. "You'll regret this." He leaned down, sneering. "People like you always say that," and then just as quickly as it began, it ended. Riker opened the door and gestured back toward the hall. "You're free to go courtrooms that way," he said mockingly. Celeste rose slowly, hands trembling only slightly. She took her badge back from Riker's desk without asking and walked out into the hall. Her steps were even, her expression unreadable, but in her chest something burned hotter than rage, deeper than humiliation. It was purpose, and in just a few minutes that purpose would change everything. Because what Riker didn't know was this. She wasn't there to observe. She wasn't there as a defendant. She wasn't there for anyone else's judgment. She was the judge, and she was about to take her seat on the bench. The clippers buzzed in her ears long after she left that cold, windowless room. Every step she took toward the courtroom felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of fury held in check. Her scalp tingled where her hair had once proudly grown silver, coils years in the making, rooted in family and history and identity, now gone. Uneven tufts were all that remained. The silence in the hall felt suffocating. Celeste passed two clerks who looked at her, then quickly looked away. They had heard, maybe they had even seen, but not one of them had spoken up. She didn't stop walking. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down the corridor. A low hum of voices filtered from the courtroom double doors. It was a high-profile morning, a police misconduct hearing. Several officers involved in a brutal incident during a protest last year. National attention. Heavy press. Celeste was supposed to enter from the private chambers, her robe waiting inside, staff prep decorum preserved. But today, that plan didn't matter. She stopped just outside the courtroom, took a deep breath, then pushed both doors open wide. The courtroom stilled instantly, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned, and then the realization began to ripple. Her shoes clicked loudly against the marble floor as she walked past rows of lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared in confusion, others in disbelief at the front behind the judge's bench. Her chair sat empty, waiting, and then it hit them. The woman they had watched be escorted through the hall like a suspect. The woman whose scalp bore the evidence of brutality was not a victim of circumstance. She was the judge. Celeste stepped behind the bench and turned slowly to face the courtroom. Her face was calm cold, even the kind of calm that comes not from peace but from precision. Someone near the defense table dropped a pen, the bafe. The same man who had held the clippers was still posted by the side door. When she made eye contact with him, he went absolutely still. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for the robe folded neatly over the arm of her chair. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for ceremony. She slipped it on herself, one slow movement at a time. It rested on her shoulders like armor. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" she asked. "Voice even?" The clerk's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste nodded once, then lowered herself into her chair, the leather groaning softly beneath her. She looked straight ahead. Her gaze never touched the man who had humiliated her. Not yet, not directly. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony on Case 2371F, United States versus Charleston Police Department," she said as if nothing had happened, charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations. All parties present. A murmur of yes. "Your Honor," echoed back. The attorneys were shifting in their seats. Some were wide-eyed, others looked guilty, and some looked angry. Angry that a black woman had dared walk in after what they assumed had destroyed her. She ignored them all. "We will proceed." The first witness was called an officer who had been on duty during the protest in question, a man who had pushed an elderly veteran to the ground during a peaceful demonstration, breaking two of his ribs. Celeste listened carefully, took notes, asked no questions. Not yet. From the corner of her eye, she saw Riker slowly backing toward the rear of the courtroom. His hands twitched at his belt. His legs shifted restlessly. He looked like he wanted to disappear, like he knew deep in his gut that his moment was coming. He was right. After the second witness, she called a recess. The courtroom emptied in a daze. Even the lawyers whispered like they were afraid to speak too loud. Celeste stayed seated. After several minutes, when only her clerk, two officers, and Riker remained in the room, she finally looked at him. "Deputy Riker," she said, voice sharp as glass. He stopped mid-step, stepped forward, his mouth open, stammering, Yes, Your Honor." She motioned to the open center of the courtroom. Now he obeyed, moving like a man walking toward a cliff's edge. "State your full name for the record," he blinked. "Excuse me, you heard me, Hank Riker. How long have you served as bailiff at this courthouse? 14 years? She tapped a pen against her legal pad, once, twice, then she leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that screening room?" The color drained from his face. Your Honor, I didn't know. That's not what I asked." He looked around for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you?" "Deputy Riker, I'm not sure." Celeste's voice rose, not in volume but in precision. 12. 12. Formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed. Because you hid behind procedure and protocol. His mouth trembled. "I didn't know who you were, I thought. And that's the problem, isn't it?" She snapped, her voice cracking the stillness. "You thought I was no one, just another black woman? You could bully, shave, humiliate for sport?" The room was dead silent. "You didn't even bother to ask for my name." Riker tried to speak, but no sound came. Celeste rose from the bench. "Because of you, this courthouse, this supposed temple of justice, has been stained. Because of your actions, the sanctity of this court is now under question, and because you assaulted a federal judge in her own courthouse, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation." Effective immediately, she turned to the officers standing by the exit escort. "Deputy Riker into custody. Separate from general population. Formal charges to follow." The officers moved quickly, cuffs already in hand. "No, wait," Riker shouted. "You can't do this," but he was wrong. She already had. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore, not after what had just happened. Deputy Hank Riker, once a fixture of control and intimidation in that courthouse, was now gone, escorted out in cuffs by two silent officers. His badge surrendered, his power stripped, but the aftershock still lingered. It was in the silence, in the way the ceiling fans hummed a little too loudly, in the sidelong glances shared between staff who had known for years and said nothing. Tara Mitchell sat back in her chair, fingers laced together over the bench, her robe now draped over her like steel. There was no going back to the way things were before. And truthfully, she didn't want to, because something had shifted, not just inside her, but inside the entire room. Her clerk entered quietly, holding a fresh stack of notes. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, "the next set of witnesses are being prepped." Celeste nodded. "How long do we have?" "About 8 minutes." Celeste looked past her out into the now empty gallery. Rows of wooden benches, the places where jurors, journalists, and the public would return any moment now. But she could still feel Riker's presence like an oil stain on polished marble. She exhaled slowly. This day had already defied every expectation, and it was only mid-morning. The door creaked behind her. Celeste turned. A young woman stepped inside, maybe early 20s. Glasses fogged from rushing through the lobby, one of the interns. Her name was Megan Smart. Quiet, never spoke much unless spoken to. She looked pale. Celeste gave a small nod. "Everything okay?" Megan hesitated. Then she closed the door behind her and stepped forward. I wanted to say, I saw it," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "What happened with Deputy Riker this morning outside the screening room? I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared." Celeste didn't answer right away. She just studied the young woman's trembling hands. Then she said gently, "Thank you for telling me that matters." I didn't stop it, no, Celeste replied. But you're speaking now. That's more than most. Megan looked like she might cry, but she straightened her shoulders and added, if you need me to testify, I will. Celeste reached across the desk and placed a hand over the girl's. Just for a moment, no words, just warmth. Then the courtroom doors creaked again, this time with more weight. The public was returning. Celeste stood. All rise, the clerk called out, her voice steadier this time. Everyone did, even the ones who didn't want to, even the ones who had once laughed at jokes. Riker made behind closed doors. Celeste resumed her seat. Court is back in session. As the next witness took the stand, the atmosphere in the room had changed subtly, sharply. The power was no longer in question. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a reckoning. The witness was a black father named Howard Briggs, mid-fours, a warehouse foreman, salt and pepper beard, hands rough from decades of labor. His eyes were hollow but determined. He was there to testify about how his 17-year-old son had been tackled and pinned during a peaceful protest by the same officers now seated at the defense table. One of them had crushed the boy's windpipe with his knee. The teen survived barely, but still couldn't speak above a whisper. That had been 9 months ago. Howard sat on the witness stand and told the court everything. How they had begged for paramedics, how they were told he'll be fine. He's faking. How no one listened, and how when the footage came out, none of the officers were disciplined. Celeste didn't interrupt once. She didn't need to because every word the man spoke was a blade slicing through the courtroom, leaving no one untouched. When he finished, Celeste leaned forward. Mr. Briggs, thank you for your courage. I know this isn't easy. He nodded, his voice cracking. I just want to know that it meant something, that someone is finally listening. Celeste looked at him, not from the bench, not as a judge, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be silenced. You've been heard, she said. A few minutes later, after he stepped down and walked slowly past the officers who had nearly taken his son's life, Celeste called for another short recess. Her chambers were quiet, almost too quiet. She sat for a moment staring at her reflection in the mirror above the wash basin, her uneven hair, the raw patch just above her left ear. The woman in the mirror didn't look like a judge. She looked like someone who had just been through war. But maybe that's what justice was, not a performance of poise, but a battle for truth. One she had no intention of losing. There was a knock. Her clerk opened the door halfway. Your Honor, Point U's attorney's office just submitted a sealed motion. They want to escalate charges against Riker immediately, civil rights violations under federal law. Celeste didn't blink, good accept it. As the door shut, she finally allowed herself a breath, not out of relief, but resolve. Today wasn't over, not even close, because the courtroom may have seen Riker fall, but they hadn't seen what came next. And the real reckoning was still to come. The courtroom was full again, but it wasn't the same room anymore. Something unspoken had shifted. It hung in the air, like electricity before a thunderstorm. The kind of weight that made people sit straighter in their chairs, speak a little quieter, and think twice before assuming they knew who held the power. Tara Mitchell stepped back onto the bench with a presence that was undeniable. No baif announced her this time, no ceremonial flourish, just the sound of her shoes against the hardwood floor and the quiet rustle of her robe as she took her seat. Everyone rose instinctively. She didn't speak right away. She just looked out over the room at the defendants, the press, the attorneys, and the silent crowd of onlookers who had returned, some still wide-eyed from what they'd witnessed earlier. They were waiting to see what she would do next, how far she'd go, whether this was going to be a moment or a movement. She tapped the gavel once. Court is now in session, she said, and just like that, everything settled. She turned her attention to the attorneys seated at the prosecution table. Call your next witness. The room hushed again as an officer, Lieutenant Daniel Cook, was sworn in, tall, built like a linebacker, face clean-shaven with that rigid posture that said he thought the badge made him invincible. He sat down, cleared his throat, and folded his hands in his lap. Celeste studied him for a long second. She knew the type. Proud polish, trained to lie with a smile and never break a sweat. The prosecutor began her questioning, methodical and precise. Lieutenant Cook, you were present at the demonstration on May 14th of last year, correct? Yes, ma'am. And during that time, you oversaw a team of 7 officers. Yes, that's correct. Did you personally authorize the use of force against protesters? Cook leaned forward slightly, speaking into the mic like he was giving a press briefing. I authorized non-lethal crowd control measures after protesters became aggressive. There was yelling, pushing, some were armed with bottles and rocks. Any injuries reported from your team, no ma'am, and the injuries sustained by protesters, minor mostly bruises. Celeste's voice cut through before the prosecutor could move on. Lieutenant Cook, he turned toward her. Yes, Your Honor, do you consider a crushed trachea to be a minor injury? The question hung in the air. Well, no ma'am, of course not. Celeste leaned forward slightly. Then why did your official incident report describe it as a soft tissue trauma consistent with resistance? Cook hesitated. That's standard language. It was based on initial impressions from whom he shifted in his seat. I believe it was Officer Valdez who filled out that section. Celeste kept her gaze locked on him. And did you review and approve that language? A pause. Then, yes, Your Honor, knowing that the victim was 17 years old and unarmed. Cook opened his mouth, closed it, then finally answered, yes. Her tone never wavered. Do you believe justice was served that day? Silence. I believe we followed protocol. She sat back in her chair. That wasn't the question. Cook cleared his throat again. With respect, Your Honor. I can't answer that. That's not my role. Celeste nodded slowly. No, it's mine. She turned to the prosecution. You may proceed. The rest of the testimony was dry, clinical, but every word landed like a blow. It wasn't just the facts, it was the way they tried to make them sound normal, acceptable routine. When the recess was called again, the gallery buzzed with whispers, reporters typing furiously, advocates taking notes. A woman near the back clutched her chest silently, mouthing, "Thank you," when Celeste walked past. In her chamber, she took off her robe and hung it carefully. Then she stared at it for a moment longer than usual. The way it looked on the hanger, so plain, so harmless. And yet outside that room, that robe carried weight. It changed everything. When she wore it, people stood, they listened, they feared her power. But just 2 hours earlier, wearing the same face, the same heart, the same dignity, without the robe, she was assaulted and stripped, like she didn't matter. That contradiction lived in her bones now. It burned behind her eyes and echoed in her pulse. There was a knock, Your Honor. It was her clerk again. There's someone asking to speak with you from the DOJ. They said it's urgent. Celeste straightened. Send them in. A man in a gray suit stepped through the door, calm composed. He handed over a sealed envelope, Judge Monroe. I'm with the Office of Civil Rights. I was dispatched the moment reports surfaced about this morning's incident. Fast response? Celeste said, unfolding the letter. This courthouse is under federal review. What happened in that screening room is more than misconduct. It's a Title 18 violation. And now that we know the victim was a federal judge, he trailed off. Celeste didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The man continued, We're opening an immediate investigation into Charleston District Courthouse staff prior complaints, suppression of reports, and potential obstruction. Good, she said quietly. Start with the supervisors who buried those 12 complaints against Riker, then look at the judges who signed off. He nodded as if he already knew she'd say that. Oh, and Judge Monroe, he added, pausing at the door. You should know the footage of this morning has gone viral. It's everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, SOCIIAL. Even some folks in the Senate are talking about it. Celeste gave the faintest shake of her head. I didn't do it for them. He smiled. No, that's why it matters. When he left, she sank slowly into her chair. Out there in the courtroom, the next set of defense attorneys were gathering. She could already hear their shoes against the floor, the nervous shuffle of papers, the last-minute whispers between counsel. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready, because today wasn't just about exposing one racist beef. It was about pulling the mask off an entire system, and it was far from done unraveling. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Now word had spread. First about the arrest, then the video, then the woman behind it. All the federal judge who had walked into a courthouse and been treated like she didn't belong, only to take her rightful seat on the bench. Minutes later, stripped, humiliated but unbroken, everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Camera crews hovered outside, reporters lined the back rows. Civil rights attorneys flew in from Atlanta, D.C., even Chicago. You could feel the pressure in the air. It wasn't just about a case anymore. This was bigger. It was history and justice crashing into each other in real time. Judge Tara Mitchell stood just behind the bench as the clerk whispered in her ear, "They're here, the defense attorneys. They're asking for special counsel." Celeste raised an eyebrow. On what grounds they say the case is tainted, that the judge is personally compromised? A slow breath left her lips. Of course they'd try to flip it. They couldn't deny the facts, so they'd attack the face delivering them. Celeste nodded once. Let them ask. I'll give them their answer on the record. She stepped out to a courtroom humming with tension. All rise, the room obeyed. She didn't look left or right. She just walked, took her place, tapped her gavel once. Be seated. The air shifted like a held breath being released. A defense attorney in a pinstripe suit rose confident, late 40s. One of those voices trained for both jury trials and TV interviews. Your Honor, before we proceed, we'd like to make a formal request due to recent developments, Celeste cut in. You mean the arrest of Deputy Riker and the incident in the courthouse hallway? He hesitated. Yes, Your Honor, and your concern is what exactly? He cleared his throat. That these events may present a conflict of interest, a question of judicial impartiality. The gallery bristled, a low murmur swelled. Celeste didn't blink. You're suggesting that because I was assaulted this morning, I can't carry out the duties of my position. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that the perception of bias. Celeste held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. She stood, walked slowly to the edge of the bench. I was publicly assaulted, humiliated, not for what I said, not for what I did, but for who I am, because someone saw a black woman walking into a courtroom and decided she couldn't possibly hold power. She paused, let it sink in. And what did I do in response? I took my seat. I conducted this hearing. I followed every rule, every code of conduct. I have been calm, measured, respectful, even when others were not. The attorney's jaw clenched. Celeste continued, voice sharper now. You know what real bias looks like, counselor. Real bias is a man using clippers to shave off a woman's hair without cause, without warrant, and without a single question about her name. Real bias is 12, ignored complaints from people who looked like me, buried by this very institution. She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. You want to talk about conflict of interest? Let's talk about how many judges signed off on Deputy Riker's behavior over the years. Let's talk about how many prosecutors declined to follow up. Let's talk about your firm's history of defending officers with abuse records longer than their resumes. He looked ready to object, but he didn't because she was right. Celeste straightened. This court will proceed. I will not recuse myself. And if you believe the facts of this case will not stand under my authority, you're welcome to appeal. I'll even provide the paperwork myself. She tapped the gavel again. Next witness. The prosecution called forward someone new. Not a victim, not a protester, a former courthouse employee. Middle-aged black woman. Sharp suit, cropped hair glasses. Her name was Denise. Tally. Celeste recognized her instantly. And not just from personnel files, Denise had worked in records for years, quiet, efficient, never complained. And now she was stepping into the light. Denise was sworn in, sat down, adjusted her blazer. The prosecutor approached. Miss Tally, can you tell us about your former position at this courthouse? I was the record supervisor for 8 years. Before that, I worked the front desk. And during your time here, were you ever made aware of complaints against Deputy Riker? Her eyes hardened. Yes, too many to count. Can you estimate 12 official? At least twice that many informal, and what happened to those complaints? Denise glanced toward Celeste, then spoke slowly. They were mishandled. Some were marked as resolved when they weren't. Some disappeared entirely. The courtroom stirred again. Who gave those instructions? There was a pause. Then Judge Taryn. Mahoney. That name hit like a thunderclap. Mahoney retired 6 months ago, reputation clean or respected. Celeste's own mentor once upon a time, but here it was a truth that couldn't be ignored. Why would he suppress those reports, the prosecutor asked. Denise's voice shook, but she answered. He said bringing them forward would undermine public trust, that it would make the courthouse look weak. Celeste sat perfectly still because that specific lie, was one she had heard before: justice delayed to preserve appearances, abuse tolerated in the name of order. She glanced around the room at every face who had once looked the other way. Some of them were realizing in real time that the structure they had served was not justice but silence, Denise continued. Now stronger, I watched men like Riker walk these halls with impunity. I watched young black interns get searched and questioned. I watched witnesses get intimidated and brushed off, and every time I said something I was told, that's just how it is. Her voice cracked. Well, not anymore. Celeste swallowed hard. It was the kind of testimony that didn't just support a case, it cracked a system wide open. She called for recess. Everyone stood as Celeste stepped away from the bench. One of the young reporters in the gallery whispered, "She's not just running this courtroom, she's rewriting it." And he was right, because this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond that room, and it was far from over. By early afternoon, the courthouse steps were no longer quiet. What started as a few reporters with cameras had turned into a full crowd of protesters, community leaders and citizens, black, white, old, young, some holding signs, others just standing watching. It wasn't chaos, it was something heavier than that, focused waiting, and inside Tara. Mitchell sat at her desk looking out the window of her chambers at the growing sea of faces. She could read the signs from where she was. Justice starts now, protect black women. 12 complaints, 0 accountability. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to feel it all fully. The noise, the pressure, the truth rising to the surface after years of being buried under red tape and silence. There was another knock on her door. This time it was her clerk, but behind her stood a man Celeste hadn't seen in almost a decade. Reverend Marcus Hill. He stepped forward with the calm strength of someone who'd seen too much and still chose to fight. His gray beard had grown in fully since the last time she'd seen him. His eyes were tired but kind. "Judge Monroe," he said. "Reverend," she replied, rising. "I won't take up much of your time. Just wanted you to know we're out there. We see what you're doing and we're with you." She nodded, swallowing the sudden emotion pressing at the back of her throat. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Some of these people outside, they were victims too of Riker, of others like him. They were never called into court, never heard, but they're ready now. If you want their stories, they're ready to talk. She unfolded the list names, phone numbers, handwritten notes. It was longer than she expected. How many of these are new complaints, she asked. Most. Some go back years. Some were afraid. Some were told it wasn't worth it. Celeste looked up. They were wrong. It is worth it now. Marcus smiled faintly. It is because of you, she didn't reply, but her silence was louder than words. When he left, she stared down at the list again. These weren't just names, these were the people this courthouse had ignored, who had been brushed off, laughed at, written off, but not anymore. Back in the courtroom, the gallery had doubled. Word of Denise Thalley's testimony had spread like wildfire. Reporters had started live streaming. People outside were now watching on their phones through courthouse windows, huddled together in the October sun. The energy had changed. When Celeste walked in, the room stood again. But this time it felt different. Not just out of tradition, not just for her title, but for what she represented. Now she tapped the gavel once. We're ready to proceed. The next witness was unexpected. The U.S. Marshal S. Office had sent someone not to investigate, but to testify. His name was Andrew Taylor Black, late 50s, over 20 years of service. He walked with a slight limp, the result of an injury sustained back in 2001 during an arrest gone wrong. He had been stationed in the same courthouse years ago, and now he stood before the bench again, this time with a truth he couldn't carry in silence anymore. He took the oath, sat down, and adjusted the mic. "I worked here from 2004 to 2012, he said. "I saw a lot, most of it. I let slide. I didn't want trouble. Didn't want to be labeled the angry black officer. He looked straight at Celeste. But what I saw from Riker I should have reported. I didn't, and I regret it. Celeste nodded slowly, allowing him the space to speak without interruption. Taylor continued. He started small disrespect, over-policing young men making comments, but it got worse. And by 2010, he wasn't just aggressive, he was dangerous. Did you report him? The prosecutor asked. I filed a memo to Internal Affairs, he said. It disappeared. When I asked about it, I was told, quote, he's the kind of man we want handling difficult people. The room reacted with disgusted murmurs as Celeste's gavel quieted them. Taylor sat forward. I left this courthouse 2 years later, not because of the work, but because of what it did to me. The silence, the guilt, but now I'm here to tell the truth because Judge Monroe, what you did sitting in that chair after what they did to you, that's bigger than a bench. The room was still, and Celeste for the first time all day didn't have an answer, not because she was speechless, but because sometimes when history shows up at your feet, you don't speak over it, you let it echo. The next morning, the air outside the courthouse was heavier than usual. Charleston's early fall sky was gray, low, pressing down on the city like a warning. But inside, Judge Tara Mitchell's chambers, the silence felt colder. She sat at her desk with a thick manila folder in front of her, one marked Confidential Internal Records. It had been slipped to her by a court administrator who didn't say a word, just nodded, left it on her desk, and walked out like it burned his hands to touch it. Celeste opened it slowly. Inside were documents, memos, emails, SSS signatures. 12 formal complaints filed against Deputy Hank Riker over the last 15 years, all dismissed, all signed off by a name she knew too well. Judge Terrence Mahoney, her former mentor, her sponsor into the federal circuit, the man who once told her she was exactly what the bench needs. But now she saw his signature at the bottom of denial after denial. Each form stamped with bureaucratic indifference. Allegation unsubstantiated, lack of corroborating evidence, no further action required. And then, tucked at the back of the folder, one memo stood out, a confidential communication between Judge Mahoney and the head of courthouse security from 5 years ago. Celeste read it once. Then again it said, Riker may be rough around the edges, but he keeps order, especially with certain groups, best to leave well enough alone. Her fingers curled around the page until it crumpled. There it was, the quiet part said out loud. And it wasn't just about Riker anymore. It was the entire machine that had kept him safe, that had protected him, endorsed him, encouraged him to get rougher, louder, crueler so long as it served order. Celeste leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a purge. She looked down at her own reflection in the glossy desk, her uneven hair, her tired eyes, and yet the fire still burned behind them. There was a knock, her clerk again. Your Honor, she said quietly, we've received a formal inquiry from the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're asking for your statement on judicial oversight failures tied to the Riker incident. Celeste gave a humorless smile. Of course they are. Now that the cameras are rolling. The clerk hesitated. There's more. 2 retired judges and 1 former DA just resigned this morning, citing health reasons. Celeste didn't respond. She just stood. Bring in the attorneys, all of them. We're going to finish this today. An hour later, the courtroom was standing room only again, and this time it wasn't just locals, reporters from the New York Times, Washington Post. Even BBC were squeezed into the gallery. A row of young black law students sat shoulder to shoulder in the front pew, notebooks in their laps, eyes wide open. This was no longer just about Charleston. This was national now. Celeste took her seat, tapped the gavel. This court is in session. She turned her attention to the room. Before we proceed with closing arguments, I'd like to enter into the record new material provided to this court. She nodded to her clerk, who handed a copy of the folder to both tables. This includes all complaints previously filed against Deputy Riker, all correspondence related to their suppression, and the names of every individual who signed off on dismissing them. The defense attorney tried to object, but Celeste raised her hand. Sit down. The words were soft but final. She turned to the gallery. Let the record show that this court is no longer interested in protecting institutions at the expense of individuals. We are no longer pretending that silence is neutrality. Her eyes swept the room. Every signature in this folder represents a choice, not a mistake. A choice to ignore victims, to protect predators, to maintain an illusion of order built on fear. She looked directly into the defense attorney's face, and it ends today. A hush fell over the room so deep you could hear someone's pen stop mid-scratch, and then from the far side of the room a voice called out, "Your Honor?" It was a man in his 60s standing hesitantly by the doorway. "May I speak?" There was a pause. Then Celeste gave a small nod. He stepped forward, hat in hand. "My name is Louis Bryant," he said, voice shaking. "I was arrested in this building in 2011 by Riker for raising my voice when my daughter's case was dismissed. He slammed me into a wall, broke 2 of my ribs." Celeste nodded. "Was a complaint filed? I filed it myself right over there at the front desk, and they told me I tripped and fell. That's what the report said. I never came back." He looked around the room, "But I'm here now." Celeste stood. "Anyone else?" A pause, then one by one hands began to rise. 5, 10, 15 people, every one of them with a story, every one of them with a silence that had lasted too long, and now finally a voice. Celeste didn't cry, she didn't smile, she didn't even move. She just watched as the truth rose all around her, not whispered, not hidden, not protected by robes or badges, but spoken at last. The final day of the hearing began with rain, not a soft drizzle, not a cleansing shower, a downpour, the kind that washed over Charleston like a warning and a reckoning. At the same time, streets flooded, power lines swayed, but still they came. Reporters, protesters, clerks, interns, witnesses. They came with umbrellas, ponchos, cameras, and signs. Because by now, everyone knew what was happening in that courtroom wasn't justice, it was history. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but electric. The air had a pulse, the kind you feel just before something irreversible happens. Tara Mitchell walked into the courtroom in silence. No gavel yet, no declaration. She paused at the front of the bench, looked out at the packed gallery, and then she took off her robe, folded it gently, laid it across the chair. She stood there, no longer shielded by title or tradition, just a woman scarred and standing. And she spoke. "I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe, carried the title delivered. Rulings followed procedure, but I've also stayed silent longer than I should have, and today I'm done being quiet." She glanced to the defense table, to the prosecution, then to the courtroom full of citizens who had once been silenced, ignored, cast aside. This court finds Deputy Hank Riker guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct. But it doesn't stop there. She stepped forward. This court also recommends immediate review of every complaint ever filed under his name and formal investigation into any official who suppressed them. She turned to the court reporter, put that on the record. There was no applause, only silence, the kind of silence that follows a bomb dropping. Then slowly she reached for a folder beneath the desk, one that hadn't been opened yet. She held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, "is a policy proposal effective immediately. I am instituting a mandate for all BAFES marshals and courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction." Her voice never wavered. "It's called the Monroe Mandate." A few heads lifted at the name. "It requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, regular evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior inside federal carouses." She held it in the air. "And I will take this to the circuit, to the judiciary, to the Senate, if I have to. Because what happened to me should have never happened to anyone. And I'm going to make damn sure it never happens again." There was movement in the gallery now. Small nods, silent tears, hands gripping one another in stunned solidarity. She continued, "I want to make something very clear. This was never about revenge. It's about responsibility, accountability, about looking this broken system in the eye and saying, not anymore." She turned to the defense and to those who allowed this man to operate without consequence for over a decade. "Consider yourselves on notice. She tapped the folder again. I will be forwarding recommendations for disbarment, formal review, and possible charges to the Department of Justice for every official who played a role in burying the truth. The courtroom didn't move, couldn't move. Then Celeste looked up just past the benches toward the tall arched window behind the gallery. Storm was still raging outside, but light was beginning to filter through a beam of sun breaking across the marble floor. She nodded once as if accepting the timing. Before we conclude, there's one more piece of business. She looked to the side entrance. The officers opened the door and Hank Riker walked in, still in cuffs. No longer in uniform, his face pale, hollow, broken in a way that had nothing to do with bruises or beatings. He was led to the front, stood beside his public defender. Celeste faced him, not with vengeance, but with fire. Mr. Riker, this court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law, 6 years. Imprisonment for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and an additional year for obstruction. She paused, but that's just the legal part. He didn't look up, and here's the human part now. Her voice dropped calm but slicing. You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You thought the badge made you immune, that silence would shield you, that people like me would never hold the gavel. Her eyes locked onto his. Well, now you get to sit in the seat you made for others, no badge, no robe, just the weight of what you've done. She nodded to the officers. Take him away. As Riker was escorted out, the courtroom didn't clap. No one cheered. They just watched because it wasn't about celebrating, it was about witnessing. And sometimes that's more powerful than applause. Celeste looked down at the file again. The Monroe mandate. She closed it, lifted her robe from the bench, and spoke one final time. Court is adjourned. The courthouse emptied slowly like a storm clearing. One drop at a time. People didn't rush out. They lingered, quiet conversations, soft embraces. A few stopped to touch the banisters, the courtroom doors, as if grounding themselves to a place that had until now felt like a fortress. Too cold to ever bend, Celeste sat alone in her chambers. The file folders were gone. The courtroom was quiet. The robe hung on the back of her chair like it always did. But this time it felt different, lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because it had been spoken out loud. She turned in her chair and faced the mirror behind her desk. Her reflections stared back. The uneven patches on her scalp had started to grow out. The silver coils that once crowned her head were coming back, but slowly, unevenly, there was a part of her that wanted to hide them, to cover the scars, to smooth over the pieces that still felt exposed. A knock broke her thoughts. It was her sister, Nayan. She didn't say a word as she entered, just walked over and pulled a folding stool from the corner of the room. She set it behind Celeste, pulled out a small pair of clippers and plugged them in. You ready? She asked Celeste. Met her eyes in the mirror. There was no fear there anymore. Just resolve. Yeah, she whispered. Let's finish it. Nain moved slowly, gently. Each pass of the clippers was careful, deliberate. The remaining uneven strands fell away one by one, not in shame this time, not as an act of violence, but as a choice, a clean start. When Nadine was done, she handed Celeste a mirror. Celeste turned it over in her hand before finally looking. The reflection stared back, bold, bare, strong, and beautiful. You could rock that every damn day and still own every room you walk into, Nayan said with a grin. Celeste didn't answer right away, just stared at herself. This is who I am now, she said softly. No, Nayan corrected. This is who you've always been. Now the rest of the world just caught up. They both smiled. That night, Celeste walked out of the courthouse without a wig, no scarf, no hat, just her head held high and bare under the city lights. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, a small group of onlookers spotted her. There were no cameras this time, no reporters, just people. One woman, maybe in her 70s, brown-skinned with thick glasses, stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Celeste's arm. I never thought I'd live to see someone like you do what you just did, she said, voice trembling. Celeste took her hand. You did more than survive. You paved the road. Behind her, a teenager approached shilly. No words, just a look. Then she pulled off her hoodie, revealing her own short-shaved head, and nodded. Celeste nodded back. Something passed between them, a silent inheritance. Later that night, Celeste stood on her front porch looking out over her quiet neighborhood. Porch lights flickered gently. A wind stirred the oak trees. Inside, her phone buzzed. Dozens of texts, emails, news headlines, but she let them wait. Tonight wasn't about the noise. It was about finally hearing herself breathe. The next morning, she returned to the courthouse business as usual, at least on paper, but people noticed. The robe stayed off longer than usual. The stares lingered, but differently. This time, not in confusion, not in dismissal, but in recognition. When she stepped into the judge's elevator, the janitor nodded at her with a small fist to his chest, a gesture of pride. One of the younger security officers gave a subtle thumbs up, then quickly looked away, blushing. And when she entered the courtroom for a new hearing, just a routine civil dispute, the entire room stood before the clerk, even announced her. That had never happened before. She nodded once and sat. The law didn't stop. There were more cases, more motions, more files. But something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just in the rules, it was in the room. Justice had a new face now, and it didn't apologize for the space it took up. Celeste walked the halls differently, not louder, not harsher, just fuller, like someone who had been made to shrink for years and finally remembered what standing at full height felt like. The cameras still came. There were interviews she didn't do, headlines she didn't read, but one caught her eye. A few days later, taped to the break room fridge. Federal judge refuses to back down after public assault. Launches historic reform from the bench. Someone had scribbled in Sharpie below it, "She's our judge." And that made her smile. She didn't set out to become a symbol, she set out to do her job. But somewhere along the way, standing her ground became something more. It became permission for others to stand. 2 months passed. The courtroom that had once echoed with silence and fear now held something different. Not perfection, not peace, but presence. A different kind of stillness. The kind that came when people knew they would be heard. The Monroe mandate had spread first within the courthouse, then across the district. Other judges adopted it. Other cities called about it. A bill was being drafted in Congress. Now Celeste hadn't planned that, but then again, so much of what happened wasn't planned. She just hadn't backed down. That alone was enough to turn the tide. She kept working day in, day out, civil disputes, custody cases, tax hearings. But behind every decision now lived a deeper intention, a louder awareness. Not just what the law said, but who the law had ignored. One afternoon, Celeste stepped into a middle school classroom. The teacher had invited her to speak about justice, about courage. She expected 10 kids and some awkward silence, but the room was packed. They had watched the trial, read the articles. Some had written essays, others made signs. There was one taped to the chalkboard that simply said, "Be like Judge Monroe." She didn't speak long, she didn't need to. The kids asked the real questions. How do you stay calm when people hate you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered them all honestly, but the last one stuck with her, a quiet girl in the corner, barely louder than a whisper. Do you still believe in the system? Celeste paused and then said, I don't believe in what the system was. But I believe in what it can become, and I believe in people like you asking that question. That's how it changes. When she left the school, she cried in the car for the first time in months. Not from pain, from hope. Not long after that, the White House called. Not for a soundbite, for something more. Tara Mitchell had been chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised speeches, prepared dignitaries in the room, but none of that mattered to her. What mattered was who would be in the front row, Nan, her clerk, her former intern. Megan, now a first-year law student, Reverend Hill, And sitting in the far corner, surrounded by rows of suited officials, would be the quiet girl from the classroom, the one who asked the real question. The stage was large white marble steps leading up to the podium. The president stood to the side. When Celeste stepped forward, the applause rose like a wave. But she didn't raise her hand, didn't wave. She simply stepped to the microphone and began, "I wasn't supposed to be here." The room went still, not because I wasn't qualified, not because I didn't earn it, but because for most of my life, systems like this one weren't built with people like me in mind. She looked out over the crowd, and when I finally stepped into the spaces I had worked my whole life to reach, I was still reminded that I didn't belong a long breath. But I stayed, I stood, and I made them see me. She paused. "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was lucky enough to survive a moment that should have broken me. And because I knew too many others who didn't." A flashbulb clicked somewhere in the crowd. So this medal isn't just mine, it belongs to every woman who was told to stay quiet. Every man who was told justice wasn't for him. Every child who looked at the law and saw only fear, "This is for you." The applause that followed wasn't explosive, it was respectful, deep, like people clapping for something they finally understood. As the ceremony ended, Celeste stepped off the stage, and somewhere far away in a state prison across the state line, Hank Riker watched the broadcast from a small mounted television. He didn't blink, didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared as the woman he had once tried to break stood before the nation and was honored for the very strength he tried to erase. The screen went black after the credits rolled, but the silence in the room stayed with him. Not punishment, just truth. And truth, it turns out, is the one thing he couldn't silence. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a story about one woman or one courthouse. It was a story about dignity, truth, and what happens when we finally say enough is enough. Judge Tara Mitchell didn't just uphold the law. She became the line in the sand. She reminded us that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about accountability. It's about the strength to rise after being stripped down, to speak when silence is easier, and to lead with integrity even when the system turns against you. For those of us who've lived long enough to see both change and resistance, this story hits deeper because we know real progress is slow, it's costly, and it demands courage from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you've watched a loved one face injustice. Maybe you felt powerless in the face of it all. But this story shows power doesn't come from a badge or a title or even a bench. It comes from standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories that challenge, inspire, and speak truth out loud. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins with us together right now.